So, welcome back to Live at Kigali, a part of Kigali 2023, the Kigali Global Dialogue. This year brings together experts from 70 odd countries to discuss some of the most important questions all of us as humanity need to respond to. And to respond to some of those, I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Suklal, the Sherpa for BRICS for South Africa, but also the ambassador at large for a large swath of the emerging world, Asia, and of course, the continent and its place in the world order, its place in global institutions, key agreements, and key arrangements that are unfolding. Ambassador Suklal, a very warm welcome to Live at Kigali.
Thank you. Thank you, Samir, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here as part of the Kigali Dialogue, and I'm pleased that we are meeting in Africa, in Kigali, to discuss Africa.
So, Ambassador Suklal, yesterday you and I had a conversation on the vision for BRICS, the dynamics within the BRICS, the discussions around its expansion, around single currencies, around trading, around its role in the world. Today, I think it's time to focus on this continent. It's very important simply because we have been overwhelmed by a deluge of news coming out of Europe, and scant attention has been paid to other regions. And certainly the continent, which is in one sense the most dynamic continent, young and aspirational, and in another sense is buffeted by headwinds that are not necessarily favorable, be it climate change, be it weak balance sheets, be it differences within. And without necessarily discussing the big questions around it, I think I'll jump straight to the specifics. 2 years down the road, post the pandemic, what is the economic health of the continent today?
Well, look, Samir, the African continent was very negatively impacted by COVID, perhaps more so than the rest of the world. One of the reasons being also our health infrastructure is not what it should be, so we were at a major disadvantage. But secondly, and I think more importantly, access to vaccines. During the pandemic, what we saw was vaccine nationalism, vaccine hoarding, and poorer countries, Africa included, being marginalized and not given access to vaccines, despite the fact that, as you have pointed out, they say that Africa is important and we need to focus attention on Africa. But when it mattered most, our major partners, especially from the global north, deserted us. And we had to turn to the global south. India especially came to our rescue and provided vaccines for a large number of countries, gratis in most cases. And I think at a time of crisis, you recognize who your true friends are and who stand by your side. And I think COVID pointed this out. Of course, we are now in the post-COVID recovery phase. Africa's economy was badly hit by the COVID pandemic, and the recovery is very slow for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think we need to be honest with ourselves as Africans. As we celebrated the 60th anniversary of the founding of the OAU originally, it's time for us to also reflect. What have we done right and what haven't we done right? And I think, of course, we always contextualize Africa in terms of at least the past 400-500 years that have been a very difficult period for the African continent, starting with slavery, colonialism, racism, and of course, ultimately the period of decolonization, independence, and so forth. But most African countries today have been independent for over half a century. And is Africa where it should be in 2023? And I think the honest answer is no. And why is this the case? I think we have made several mistakes along the line. And also, I think the kind of assistance we got from the global community is not the assistance we needed and the guidance we needed. Africa was not as fortunate as Europe post-World War II, where there was a Marshall Plan and a tremendous injection of resources to lift Europe.
No, so that's an important point, and I'll come back to Africa Marshall Plan for the future, and I think that's an important point to discuss. I also want to discuss the AU a bit more, the African Union a bit more. It turned 60, and of course, it will have to play a much larger role. in the days ahead, and we can try and decipher what's going right, what's going wrong there. But let me first come to the vaccine issue that you had raised. Now, given that, and in my own travels in Africa, I know I was in your country in South Africa, and now I'm in Rwanda, I've been to Ethiopia. I keep hearing about a few observations from various people. I have an Indian vaccine, I have a Chinese vaccine, I have a Russian vaccine. I hear this often. Sure. I hear this often in this continent. Now tell me, is this going to significantly impact future partnerships for this continent? Is that really going to affect the future of trade, the future of infrastructure investments, the future of security partnerships, of political alignments? Is that something that we will get over, or is that something that is going to leave its signature on the future?
Well, that's something I think that is of concern for us in Africa, and I think this is one of the issues that is receiving serious attention within the AU. When we are in 2016, the AU decided to look at reform of the AU, led by President Kagame. And one of the areas we have been looking at is the multiple partnerships that Africa has. And of course, many describe Africa as the last frontier of development, and rightly so. Africa has tremendous opportunities in terms of its development trajectory. But we are also seeing a scramble for Africa, in that everyone suddenly wants partnership with Africa. And it's interesting, recently, Kenyan Prime Minister Ruto has been speaking quite a lot about this issue, about the partnerships. Is it correct for an entire continent of 54 sovereign states to meet with one country? And should we not look at a different formula, perhaps the AU chair, the AU Commission chair, and the heads of RECs should meet with our partners rather than taking 54 heads of state into a meeting? This is something under consideration. The various partnerships are being reviewed. What value does it bring to Africa, and does it work for Africa? Of course,
and is that idea coming from a space that why should we parade 54 leaders for one sovereign who's visiting us? We should have a relationship of equality, yes, at the same levels, right? Is that
very much? It is very much, and also it must be centered through the AU. We have a continental organization. Not all of our partnerships go via the AU route, and I think that's undermining our continental organization. And
so you don't want to repeat the mistake of EU, where the sovereign bilateral relationships sometimes override what the EU decides to do as a whole.
Absolutely. If we want to strengthen the continental organization and see it as our pivot and the center of gravity of what we do in Africa, we must give that its rightful space, and we must empower that entity.
Now, to be fair to the EU, they have created a very strong economic union.
Sure.
They are not necessarily a very strong political union. Countries are not necessarily, at least the big ones, are not willing to cede their sovereign decision-making to the bureaucrats in Brussels. What is the dynamic in the continent? What are the areas where it's easier to cooperate, and where do you see differences and lack of interest in cooperation?
Well, I think on the political front, there is the political will to move Africa forward as a collective. I think on that front, there's great gravity.
Okay.
The fact that we have the AU, we have created institutions to underpin the functioning of the AU, very good institutions, the Pan-African Parliament, African Peer Review Mechanism, and so forth. But where we are weak is in economic integration. I mean,
so it's a flip of the...
It's a flip of the EU, and that's where we need to give attention. Of course, we are on the right path now with the launch of the African Free Trade Agreement, but of course, we're very hopeful. I mean, inter-African trade is small, 16 to 18% compared to other regions. And I was just listening to the Director General of WTO, Okonjo Iweala, and she was saying we need to not double but triple Africa's share of trade. But that's good. We've been saying that for a long time. But how do we do it? And there are a number of factors that's undermining the drive in terms of greater economic integration and Africa's industrialization process. How do we take advantage of new technologies, digitization, and so forth? And there, I think we not on the same page. Now, listening also to the head of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement Secretariat, just yesterday, commenting that Africa is more fragmented now than it's ever been before. Our business community is complaining that there are a number of red tapes. As much as we have rolled out the FTA, and both phase 1 and phase 2 of tariff negotiations has been completed, but when you get to the actual application of it, you find there are a number of hurdles. And I think this is where we have to place our attention in the coming years. If we want to achieve the goal we have set out by 2035, we would have doubled inter-African trade, or else we'll find ourselves running on the same spot. Now, I can give you a good example. I was very involved in the evolution of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD. I was part of that original team. Now, NEPAD is over 20 years old. But if you look at what we envisage for NEPAD, and 2 decades down the line, we are not quite there. Again, it's in the application of very good policies that we put in place where we are very weak.
So is it because of overwhelming presence of bureaucracy or an underwhelming presence? Are we understaffed and do we need a stronger secretariat? Or do you think we have bureaucratized the functioning of the EU?
I think it's both. It's a combination of both.
Okay.
That's why it's a potent mix, because you have over-bureaucratization and under-resourced. Now, if you, for example, let's look at the AU. Now, again, including President Kagame and others, President Ramaphosa included, have been saying, we are 54 African states, but we can't be independent in terms of our contribution towards the AU's budget. In 2023, 58% of the AU's budget is from donor countries. Now, how can you
Have agency if you are still dependent on
if you are
outsiders?
dependent on outsiders to run it? And interestingly, the major part, over 50% of the AU budget goes to peace and security. It should be going to economic development.
SDGs and the development agenda.
Absolutely.
No, so I think that's the point. I think I can now move to the Marshall Plan. I think that's an important aspect. If you were to have a cursory glance on the across the balance sheets of the countries in the continent, you would find many, in fact most, and some of the bigger ones as well, suffering from the trifecta of challenges, 3 big issues they need to confront. The first is the level of debt and indebtedness, fragile balance sheets in some sense. The second is unfinished and still a big journey ahead on the development agenda, so the SDGs. And the third is a climate challenge, which is affecting agriculture, water availability, and of course, extreme events. Now, the trifecta of challenges that is being faced by this continent and most countries across it requires, of course, sensible internal allocations and resource mobilization. But I don't think you can do it alone. I think we require a war chest in many ways that can sensibly invest in responding to all 3 together: climate, development, and growth, economic growth. Do we have takers for this? Or are we still seeing lip service? Are there commitments on the table, or are there foreseeable future inflows that you can sense? Or are we still struggling to mobilize global money? There's a great global interest. They see you as a market, they see you as a resource hub, they see you as young demographics, but all of that serves value creation in their own countries, benefits for their own GDPs. Are we seeing countries interested in investing in a large, prosperous Africa?
I would say it's a mixed bag, Samir. I mean, if you look at Africa in terms of partnership, I don't think any other continent has the number of partnerships that we have. EU Africa, USA Africa, TCAD, FOCAC, IAFS, Korea Africa, Turkey Africa, the list, Arab Africa, the list is endless. Now, given all of these partnerships with very weighty countries and weighty regions of the world, we should, of course, be in a better space. So if you look at all of these partnerships, they're good in terms of the content, but in the application, again, we fall short. Now, I think in this regard, both sides are to blame because we have very good meetings, but the follow-up, there's a weakness in that. So I think these partnerships are very important for Africa, but it has to be coordinated. We don't want competition amongst our partners that undermines the development assistance and the economic assistance that Africa needs, including issues of climate change, which devastates this continent. We are seeing its impact, especially on food production, and Africa can be the food basket of the world. We have 60% of world's arable land, but we are not. Agriculture is still such a small percentage of African GDP. And we need to, again, interrogate these partnerships and make them work for mutual benefit. Of course, partnerships are there. But at the moment, I don't think they are achieving the goals they have set out to achieve. And I think we need to become more microscopic in terms of what this partnership entails. We need those partnerships, as you rightfully pointed out. Africa's development must be in partnership with our global friends. And in fact, when we developed the blueprint on NEPAD, that was what we were told. NEPAD emanated out of an engagement with the G8. In 2000, the then OAU summit asked 3 presidents to represent Africa and go to the G8 to ask them for assistance with Africa's development. It was Obasanjo of Nigeria, Bouteflika of Algeria, and Mbeki of South Africa. And they went to the Okinawa summit. Japan was in the chair. And the initial response from the G8 was, you go and come back, give us a Marshall Plan. That's the word they used. You tell us what your
you
needs
want.
are. And that's how NEPAD came about. We went back with a blueprint to say, this is what we want for our continent, and we want the G8 to assist us. And subsequently, we've had numerous partnerships. These partnerships have had value for us, but I don't think they've brought the real value that they can bring to Africa. And I think both sides...
But the Marshall Plan still eludes you.
It still eludes us. It still eludes us.
So how does someone who lives in this continent, and you are clearly one of those who's globally aware of, who's aware of what's happening in the world, how do you respond when you see hundreds of millions and billions and perhaps, God knows, by the end of the decade, $1 trillion that would have been literally donated by Western Europe and North America to, say, Ukraine, the Ukraine conflict? How do you assess that? That here is a large geography that opens its purse strings and pumps money into a conflict to defend its interests or its core political underpinnings. And that same geography is unwilling to partake in your development and growth. And yet, Africa is heavily invoked when they want to sound moral and ethical. Are people sensing clear discrimination and hypocrisy in the attitudes of some of these large economies with large budgets and large savings and surpluses?
I think the Russia-Ukraine conflict has demonstrated the true commitment of our partners in the North to Africa. Because look at the resources being pumped into the war, and look at the development assistance that's devoted to our continent. It's absolutely disproportional, to put it mildly. So if you are really, and look at, if you look at Africa's share of the global economy today at 3%, that's a pittance. And why are we there? And yet we say, in terms of resource richness, we are the richest on the continent. Our partners, our former colonial partners, they had an opportunity on the occasion of our sovereignty and independence to help us to develop and make sure our resources work for us. What you have today, Africa's exports to the global market is still resource-based, including South Africa. And we are saying we need to industrialize. We need to be part of the fourth industrial
right now,
revolution.
I would argue you have perverse and extractive relationships where you are part of a supply chain that builds their values.
Absolutely.
But Ambassador, my final question to you as we come to the end of this conversation, the AU and the continent requires many more Ambassador Suklals. Have you ever been asked to be the ambassador at large for the AU and to serve the AU more specifically, not as ambassador of a member country, but of the union itself? In other words, when are we going to see more of you come and engage with the world, representing AU at 60?
Well, look, Samir, the world is a crowded place at the moment. And I look to India and what you have done in the past 9 years. You have elbowed your way to the top, and you are there at the high table. Now, Africa has to elbow its way. It's a crowded space.
No one gives you
No one
the red
gives you
carpet.
room. If you don't elbow your way through and make space and get to the high table, you are forgotten. And I think Africa needs to be more assertive. We are a continent of hope. We have tremendous opportunities. As I said, we have good policies in place. We need to show leadership, and that we are a responsible part of the world, and that we are an equal part of the world. And we have to fight for that space. It's not going to come to us.
I think that's a good note to end this conversation. And I'm quite sure that what you have just said is possibly going to come true sooner rather than later. As all of us grow old, you will still be sprinting as a young continent, and we all have hopes on the rise of this region.
Thank you. Thank you so much.